What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Master Marketer Show. My name is Mike Grinberg. I'm the CEO of Proofpoint Marketing, and I have Jonathan Dahl with me today. He's the Chief Content Officer at Korn Ferry. We're going to have an awesome conversation. John, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
All right. So I'm gonna kick us off here. Obviously we, for those of you folks that follow us, you know that we work mainly with consulting and advisory firms. And we do a lot of things on the thought leadership side, et cetera. And oftentimes, if you look at most consulting and advisory firms, their thought leadership content all looks and sounds and feels virtually identical, and it's kind of boring. It's articles, white papers, webinars, maybe the occasional guide or research study. The research studies are usually a good piece there. But they all look the same, they sound the same, they feel the same, etc. And I've seen some that differentiate with books or podcasts are a little bit newer, but even then you get a lot of sameness going on there. Yeah, I love what you've done at Korn Ferry, and I'm just going to kick it over to you. You've done some really cool and interesting things, so maybe introduce yourself to the audience and kind of talk about the awesome things you've done.
Yeah, well, my mindset and mission is pretty much, it sounds really grand, but to reinvent modern corporate storytelling. My career was in journalism. I was a editor-in-chief of magazines at the Wall Street Journal and front page projects. And, the basics of journalism haven't really changed for decades, and they probably don't need to. But as I looked over on the corporate side, I thought to myself, wow, this could really use a revamping. It's not that it was terrible, but I think it kind of fallen into a rut. There's the biggest change that I tried to have at Korn Ferry is to impose timeliness. There's an expression for what you see a lot in corporate content, and it's called evergreen. It's like 5 ways to deal with agility. Well, you could read that now, or you could read it 5 years from now, or 5 years ago. But if you impose a timely element, if you say, and tie it to the news, if you say, well, wait a second, now we've got the U.S. presidential election coming up. We don't know who's going to be president. That could change everything. We've got AI that's not quite where we want it to be, but it will be. That can change everything. We've got interest rates, the cost of your money. It's changing. We don't know exactly when. Well, now I've tied it to something current, and hopefully that gets the reader to perk up. And now they want to hear what Korn Ferry has to say and market about agility. So that's kind of one of the main components of change. I've got many others.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a couple of core assets you've developed. I mean, you have your, I think it's This Week in Leadership one, and then the Briefings podcast, I believe, are the two that we talked about before we hit record. Maybe talk about each of those a little bit, and then I'll want to dive into kind of the how and the why and all that jazz.
Well, there's actually 6 or 7 different platforms that I oversee, and most of which I created or with my team created over the last 5 years. But the first one is, yes, This Week in Leadership. What we do is we do 5 or 6 stories a week that are tied to the news. We have a news meeting with where our partners come and they tell us, we ask them, we've seen this stuff in the news, how does this tie to your business? We put together a few short stories. That's been a big success. I think when I came to the company, we had about 600,000 page views a year. It's now 4.5 million. So it's not the 100 million I might have had at the Wall Street Journal, but I like to say it's the right 4.5 million that Korn Ferry needs. So that's the first one. When I came to the company, I was actually hired to do this magazine. It's called Briefings. That also is unusual. It appears in 300 airports. But it was mainly a print product. And as we know, that needed an upgrade to do something much more fancy and interactive in digital. So we got very much involved in that. A few other platforms I could discuss later. But the most recent one, and the one we've had the most fun with is the Briefings podcast. And again, taking that vision of reinventing corporate storytelling, the idea was to make it entertaining as well as informative. So it's not just like two talking heads talking and nothing else happening. Like what you do differently, you divide it into different chapters. You know what's coming, it's so that it's easier to follow. In our case, what we did is we have kind of like these neat little skits. I hired a former Hollywood actor and writer who's also a business content guy, and he creates a little skit that kind of makes the point up front what this podcast is going to be about. And then during the podcast itself, we intercept clips from, say, movies, TED Talks, some other places, and we incorporate that during the conversation, so it's fun. And then to kick it off, for those who watched the whole thing, by the way, we keep it short, about 15 minutes. I think that's, unfortunately, most people's attention span. We throw in a little blooper at the end. We've had a lot of fun with that, where something went wrong in the middle of it. And it's
I just watched one of your blooper reels recently. It's pretty funny.
Yes, we did a whole reel of them together. I'm very blessed to have my chief marketing officer, Jill Wilfong, is a Emmy Award-winning anchor and former news anchor. So, she's a lot of fun to work with, and she keeps it very lively.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, I love a number of things you said about, you mentioned entertaining and having fun with it. I mean, one of the things that you hear people talk about, and we definitely talk about with clients, is your content should inform, educate, entertain, and inspire. Like those are the four things, ideally more than one of those. When we look at the vast majority of thought leadership in corporate content out there, it's mostly on the inform side, right? And what I love that you've just talked about, what you've done is you've created infotainment, if nothing else, and there's a bunch of other things in there as well. So,
within that, there's also kind of like a lot of important steps. It's taken a long time to develop. But let's take This Week in Leadership, the articles. If you look on most company websites, they always just pull a stock image and the boringest picture you could possibly think of. And, most people see the image first before they even see the headline, much less read the story. So we work very hard on coming up with provocative images. And then in terms of the writing, what we try to do is like use anecdotes. We try to get the facts up high. It sounds very journalistic. It's journalistic for a reason. Journalistic's been very effective for decades in storytelling. It's provocative quotes. It isn't just somebody. I drive my team crazy by saying I don't want to see an explanatory quote. It just gives me information. I can write better than most people can talk. So save the quotes for something interesting. And then last but not least, it's got to be smart. Like we're asking at Korn Ferry people to spend a lot of money with us, or make, for advisory work that we do, or if we're involved in a recruitment for a major position, we better really know what we're talking about, right? And so you can't just say kind of too many pat things that everybody else has said, because then what's the selling proposition? The whole reason I exist is to bring you to consider Korn Ferry's business, and I've got to show that there's a reason to it. But a lot of content I see is very, very basic. And I always ask my writers the question, would somebody spend $500,000 based on the knowledge they just got from this story? And it drives them crazy, but that's each and every story's gotta have that little extra smarts to it. And that sometimes means, pushing our own partners. They're not professional storytellers. A lot of my writers say, well, they didn't offer that idea. Well, that's because that's not their job. Their job is to do fantastic consulting and fantastic hiring. But that doesn't mean they're going to know what to say in the most interesting and provocative way.
Yeah, this just brought up, there's a quote from a longtime past client that sticks out in my mind. This was forever ago, and I remember he asked us. I forget exactly what we were doing, but it's some kind of deliverable. And again, back then it was like $10,000 we were charging, which is like nothing for compared to what we do now. But back then, his question was, "Is this going to look like I paid $10,000 for it?" And that's the same kind of thing where what you just mentioned. It's everything you're putting out there is part of the Korn Ferry brand.
Yep.
And if the Korn Ferry brand is a premium brand, then everything needs to look like that premium brand, even if it's your media property or whatnot.
I mean, you do understand you have to understand there's kind of a bifurcation of the audience. So, for example, I have a thing called Briefings for Boardroom. It's an email that goes to boardroom members. Okay, so that's a very, very high level of what they're telling you. There's another website I run called KF Advanced, and it's career advice for kind of the midterm or beginning of your career. Now that's quite different, and that advice might seem very basic to a board member, but we're not sending them that story. So we're very careful about what audience we send to, and then from there we decide what's going to be new and fresh to them.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned you have a journalism background, and that seems to be a big part of the mindset shift that you brought into the organization. Talk about that. I mean, what is if you were coming in to a new organization, would you do the same thing? Is that the mindset that you really focus on to make this successful?
Well, yes, no. You kind of have to go through, like, you can't just hire a journalist and assume they're going to work well in this world. It's quite a transition. It's a different mindset for how you deal in the corporate world and how you deal in journalism. There's advocacy, but the advocacy is for your business, which is not necessarily the advocacy that either you personally believe in or where you came or how you were raised or whatever. And you see a lot of journalists who come into corporate world and they kind of are continuing to impose an advocacy into their work. And that doesn't serve the business. That's not who's paying their bill anymore. And the training that you have in journalism is very good for training you in storytelling. And that's why I favor those type of people. But as I said before, this guy from Hollywood, he was a scriptwriter, had done no journalism whatsoever. He's actually one of my best writers. So you don't have to have that background. There's some people kind of natural storytellers. And so you've got to keep a real open mind, and I do.
So let's talk about mindsets a little bit more broadly then. I mean, journalistic mindset is one. What, if you're talking to another, CMO or a chief content officer or whatever, somebody who's leading this up at another similar type organization, what's the advice you'd give them from in terms of from a mindset perspective?
Well, be curious. Understand that the way you drive people's interest is to be curious about what you do and the business that's around you and things that you see, and then broadcast that out to the reporter or to someone you're talking to, and understand that it's highly, highly competitive, just like the actual business you're running. Storytelling is just enormously, it's crazy competitive, getting eyeballs, getting attention, and realize that that's going to take a lot of work. And probably, as I say, it's going to take a lot of reinventing in how you say your mission. It's a delicate conversation. I think there's a lot of people in business who feel they know how to tell stories. It doesn't mean that, as I say, some have a natural knack for it. But the truth is, probably most don't. That's not how they were raised. And so you've got to convince them with metrics, with great stories, that it's worth to trust you to let you go ahead and write it the way you see best.
Is that Are you referring to sort of how to work with the thought leaders and the experts within the
Yeah,
organization?
yeah. Um, at Korn Ferry, we do something a little bit different. Most of the stuff is that I do, the thought leadership. There isn't time to send it back for review, and that really required a lot of trust in the beginning, made people very nervous. But I pointed out to them, look, it goes online, and you can change what's online. It's not like my days at the Wall Street Journal where, there's 100 million eyeballs and they're just looking for a mistake or a change. You can make a quick change. Um, and that required a level of trust and success. It was the success of what we did, not just in the growth of our page views, but how other media people paid attention to what we were writing and they got interviews they normally wouldn't have gotten because our stories kind of looked a little bit like. I knew what a reporter is looking for, so I presented it that way. And then, I involved them in the process. We've had that noon meeting for 7 years, Monday, without fail, so they can come and feel that they're a part of it. It's not just being told what the story is that week. They can tell us what they think.
So, in terms of building that trust, it sounds like one of the things you're kind of doing is playing to their ego, if you will, in terms of, I mean, everybody wants to get quoted and written up and, uh, you know, media attention, et cetera. I mean, all these people sort of, I mean, they make their money on, being the expert.
Well, the critical thing is, and we did a survey early on, is a byline counts for nothing. So a lot of partners would write a story, they put their byline, they thought that's how they'd sell their business. But in fact, our survey showed, and I hate to tell journalists this, no one sees the byline. But if they're quoted in the story and it's a lively quote, it's something like it was 2/3 more likely to notice that than it was the byline. And that again means that you don't have to write it yourself. You just have to have the smart things to say and that will get much more attention.
What was, I'm curious for that survey, who did it go out to? How did you, what was the audience? What
It
was it?
wasn't the most official kind of survey. I just did it early on, sent out, we had a group of stories with the byline, and we asked people how many saw the byline. And we had other stories that had the full quote and which people remembered it.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't the most official, but it also was kind of common sense if you think about it.
Sure.
You ever remember the byline? I mean, but you definitely remember an interesting thing someone said.
Right. Right. Yeah. I guess it's sort of like if I think about, reporters or columnists or whatnot who I follow, I don't, I didn't start following them because of the byline. It was something else that caused me to follow them. And then I noticed the byline
Yeah.
after the fact. It's kind of a chicken and egg
I
thing
mean,
for me.
there's some famous columnists you'll
Yeah.
follow, both in business and not. We're very blessed to have Dan Goldman. He's the emotional intelligence expert at many bestsellers, and his name is, he's got 6 million followers on LinkedIn,
Yep.
and so if it's his byline, it will play up that it's written by him. That's different. But in most cases, it's more about what you say than your name underneath it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So you talked about journalistic mindset, being curious, being able to build trust. Anything else from a mindset perspective that sticks out that's helped you be successful in this?
You got to be really brave. You got to understand that it's not going to work a lot of times in the beginning. You're going to be criticized when you try to do content. Um, you never can make everybody happy. And that takes a lot of guts to know that it's more likely someone who's not happy with the work that's going to say something to you than someone that thinks it's good. And so they're going to complain. And of course, you want to listen to that because it may be something valuable, but you want to put it in the context. At the journal, I would, work on a front page project. It might have 10 million readers, but that means, a million of them may hate it and will say something. But I have to kind of look at the 9 million I don't hear from. And it's the same thing at Wall Street, at Korn Ferry. There will be partners and people that will, for example, they look at our podcast, which has just been enormously successful. We're averaging something like, we're about 50,000 page views on YouTube alone, which is just mind-bogglingly a huge number. But that doesn't mean I haven't heard from partners who said, "Oh, those skits are silly. You've got to take that down." And I get that. But for that audience, a YouTube audience, that's what they want to see. We're trying for Gen Z. We're trying for millennials. They want a little more of that entertainment first, and they want to be lectured. And so I have to, but it takes a little guts to keep pushing that through.
Yeah. No, I think the one maybe important thing to take away and really emphasize that you've talked about is really understanding the audience that you're going after. You just mentioned it now in terms of who you're going after on that channel in particular. You talked about it before in terms of, hey, we have these different audiences for potential people who are trying to recruit versus the board versus et cetera.
And so again, if someone's not happy with the process, they may not be the audience you're trying to seek. And you have to, again, it doesn't mean you don't listen to what they say and how it affects their business or whatever, but you do take that into account it's not maybe the audience you're reaching for that particular kind of platform. Other platforms, it's a different group, and then the comments taken differently. But yeah, it takes some bravery, but it's the most fun I've ever had. It's a great team. It's a lot of creativity that bounces around when you try these different things, and it's amazing what you see from people. So we feel very fortunate.
Yeah, I'd love to maybe take a brief tangent away from what our usual format, because you mentioned creative team, etc. What does that creative process look like on your end in terms of, is there like a weekly meeting where you throw around ideas for skits? Like, take us through maybe in a little bit more detail on maybe one of these projects.
It's the most disorganized, it's not a great setup. The one setup, as I said, we do have a meeting Monday. We list how the stories did the previous week. We put out a report, and then we list maybe 20 stories we're thinking of. That gets us going for this week in leadership. But, in general, the ideas are coming from my team, from myself. We divide up different beats. So somebody may be covering, the energy sector, and they'll see something within there. But a lot of it, just you're out jogging and you think of an idea and you race back home before you forget it, and you write it to my editorial director to say, include that in the meeting. I get a lot of good ideas. Our CEO, he started the magazine, Gary Burnison, and he actually writes his fantastic bi-weekly column called Special Edition. He's got a lot of great ideas, and so we're fortunate to have conversations with him that fuels some thoughts. My CMO has a great attitude of, "Oh, I don't want that. That's boring." I hear that all the time, and I hope I don't hear it that much, but it's refreshing that the leadership above me is willing to take chances. And I think the team that does the writing and much of the story ideas, they're very interesting people themselves. They come from all walks of life, and they take different perspectives. And I appreciate the different perspectives. And as long as when you're leading a team and you have freelancers and contractors and writers, I think if you explain to them why you won't do a certain idea, you're more likely then to get a good idea after that. I think too often people just say, "Oh, that doesn't work." It doesn't, and don't take the time to explain it. And by explaining it, you kind of understand yourself why you didn't want it and can help yourself and them lead to something better.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think maybe a good transition into talking about skill sets a little bit. I think that I don't know if we want to call that creative empathy or what, but like that need to explain why you're saying no. Uh, I agree with you. Is incredibly important. I mean, that's just important as a leader of any kind. I feel like, it's one thing to tell somebody, "Hey, yeah, we're not going to do this, and let's move on," versus, "Hey, I don't think this is a good idea because X, Y, and Z, and let's try something different and give them some direction, whatever."
And you have to be open to anyone and anyone's idea. They don't have to be a professional journalist. I do have a lot of them on my staff, but that's not necessarily who it is. And you have to realize that ideas can come from almost anyone. And I think that is something you kind of get as a journalist. You learn that creativity is everywhere. And I think when you're dealing with the subjects you're interviewing, you really have to be curious and understand and dig into what they're telling you, because they probably don't know they've got a great gem of an idea buried in them, and the goal is to get to that stage.
So how? I mean, let's maybe go off of that, pulling that there a little bit more. Um, what are the like? Again, what are the skill sets required to create these great stories, whether it's from you or your team, etc.?
You have to have the discipline of being a good researcher, so that which nowadays the ability to research through Google and ChatGPT takes minutes, what used to take hours and days. So right at your fingertips, you've got to have that discipline of not going into interviews or proposing ideas without having done your homework, and it's a key skill. Sometimes you see less of that today than you used to, but it's very important. I think even if you are an introvert, you have to become an extrovert while you're talking to people, to bring it out in them. Yet at the same time, it's important to know when to be silent, so you can get people to talk and say the things that you're looking for. You have to have a hunger. I can't create hunger in people. I've got it myself. Um, I often say, it's like a runner's gunshot going off when I get out of bed every morning. I'm really into it. I think you have to be in this field to be a good storyteller. You can't be very blasé about it. You have to be very excited and very curious about almost any story you're taking on. That's how you make it provocative and interesting, because you yourself have become interested and it will reflect on the page. You have to be able to take criticism. That's not easy to do. Writing is a very personal thing. And it's just kind of amazing. I think if an outsider were to listen in to the conversations editors and writers have, they'd just be shocked. I think when you compare it to, say, the way marketers talk to each other, it's very polite, it takes 5 minutes to find out what you did wrong. Journalists or writers, that's not how it works. You just say right away what's wrong. And so you have to be kind of thick-skinned with the product that you're creating. And that's just because there's often just not enough time, and kind of the introductory way of entering it just isn't going to fly. You have to want to read. I find that the best writers are people who are reading. It may not be books, it may be websites, whatever, but they're just well read, and they enjoy it. They're not, and they find kind of the most obscure websites in the world that would seem boring to somebody else, but because it's their area, they've become really intrigued by it, and they know how to take kind of something that's obscure and a morsel of an idea and blow it up into something that is really interesting. We've just had a lot of stories over that start that way. Somebody found a research project, someone from the University of California at Berkeley, 30 years ago, was tracking attention spans of 3,000 workers. I don't know how you do that. And it was before they could turn, the longest they could go before turning to something else was 2 minutes and 47 seconds. You flash forward to today and it's 47 seconds. Now we know attention spans are low, but that really stuck. I've made for a whole cover story. It was one of our most traffic stories of the year. And it all came from that like little morsel of an idea that then, and why the writer was looking at that obscure report, I have no idea, but that's how it kind of pulls out. I love to look at myself, business, Booth, Chicago Business School has a publication called Booth. UCLA, a friend of mine has a publication, Anderson Review. I love to dig into a 30-page report to pull out that one little study or something that will intrigue people.
Yeah, I think the point you've made, both like mindset and skill set around curiosity, is a really critical one. I mean, it applies to, I would say, just about anything in business. I mean, I know I talked to our team, and that's a key thing that we always call out. It's like, if you want to be a successful strategist, you have to be curious. You have to be curious about, the client's business, how they make money, their industries, all these things. Otherwise, there's just no way to be successful.
Another skill is empathy. Our latest cover is called "Won't You Be My Friend?" And it's a story that something like 2 out of 10 people say today that they have a good friend in the workplace, which is really sad. You can understand how that's happened in the remote work era. But, that first of all, that's leaders should care about it, because people that are friends, this is kind of our work culture is created through long, strong friendships. But as a reporter and a writer, you have to feel for those people that are struggling to have friends, and have the empathy, so that when you are trying to talk to people that have that struggle, they'll talk to you about it. If you're just kind of blasé about it and, oh, well, they don't have friends, so what? Then that'll come across when you're talking to people. That idea actually started from a CEO who was telling me that he would go to the office cafeteria and he'd only see 2 people in there. And it wasn't because they didn't have return to office mandates. It was just because people weren't gathering anymore and talking to each other. And he thought that was really sad. And I believed him. I didn't think it was just a line. I could feel his empathy toward it. And he'd since taken a lot of steps and tried to change it. And those to me is that having that empathy goes a long way toward making you write something that's memorable.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing to do with the conversation to a certain extent, but so many things changed with COVID and the remote work thing. I mean, there's great things. I mean, my company's been remote for 7 years plus at this point. So we were doing it before it became the cool thing to do, but it's the changes that have come about because of it are both at work and just personal lives are just fascinating and kind of scary to a certain extent.
And then one other skill that I could think of is, you have to have a kind of a critical eye. People think that because I work now in the corporate world that there's no such thing as a negative story. In fact, almost all of our stories are negative, because the value proposition that we bring is, this is something companies are doing wrong. We're not going to name the companies. And this is the solution. We think we have a solution to it. I don't, that to me, again, is how storytelling in the corporate world has to change. You got to point out mistakes. One of my most delightful ones was finding out that companies had spent something like $40 million developing lighting, new lighting for indoor offices. And they did this because they had discovered an experiment with rats or something like that, it's the right lighting. It's going to make them more active. They're going to be more on their toes, maybe more inventive. And, we pointed out, well, that's all good and fine. But even before the pandemic, most people were making a lot of key decisions and working at home. And they would then, they might be very great at the office, but they would come home and they'd write a memo that was really stupid and like sent it to a client because they didn't have that kind of lighting. And all they had to do was give people a bulb and put it in at home if they wanted to do it. And so, that's pointing out a mistake that a company made, and then offering a solution. But most of our pieces, almost everything we write, comes with the idea of like, well, what's wrong with this? Why is this happening? Why can't they get everybody back to the office if they say that's what they want? What are they doing wrong? Here are the numbers that show it so that you're convinced. And that to me is the value proposition of corporate content.
Well, and I love it because it ties, I'm sure it ties back even more granularly to the Korn Ferry brand, but even just more broadly, it ties back to being that trusted advisor that you're being hired to be. And you're showing that through all this content, etc.
Yeah, you're pointing out what hopefully the leader hasn't noticed. And we did have a piece this week about how the financial sector been very strong about wanting people back to work, but in fact, that's not what's happening. And we asked the question: are leaders being made aware of this? I'm not saying I'm for or against mandates to go back to work, but the point is, if the company is pushing it, then or thinks they're pushing it, but they're really not policing it, then it's not effective, and they need to do something about that.
Yeah. So you mentioned research being a core skill and how Gen AI, ChatGPT, etc., Perplexity, whatever it is that you're using, has made that part of the job much faster and easier. What are some other tools? Again, not necessarily software, but I use the word tools broadly that your team uses to be successful in this endeavor.
Well, let's talk about podcasts. Riverside, which we're on, is a great tool. Really, really spectacular for then editing out what you have later. Artificial intelligence. When we wanted to have skits, not all that long ago, we would have had to hire actors for $200 an hour to create it. Now, with the use of artificial intelligent voices, you can just use a green screen and one person can act out something that might have three other people involved. So it's, and I think I've seen through your own podcast, which I'm going to look up. There's something that takes the ums out of what everybody's saying, which we'll deploy soon enough. In terms of ChatGPT, it's very helpful for research, but only in a limited way because it's not current, which we want to be. It's just a good basics to get started. Google search is still just a treasure. And then it's important to have, if you're a writer, certain beats and areas that you're covering, that you have the blogs and the websites that are covering your area. So you build a knowledge. That's one of the great things about whether it's corporate content writing or journalism writing. It's kind of a free education. If you do your work, you're gonna learn about that field. So it's having a library, a modern library of blogs and research that builds your base.
So Results. That's always the fun one. I mean, you've obviously been very successfully been there for a number of years, spun up a number of these properties that we discussed, a number of them already. What can you share about the results of that effort?
Well, our audience size for This Week in Leadership, as I said before, it started at 600,000 5 or 6 years ago, a year for views. Now it's 4.5 million. Our open rates are in the 20%. They're hard to get kind of higher, but that's been a big success. Podcast, as I said, is averaging about 50,000 page views. Some episodes get 30,000. Our highest was 94,000. So it's metrics, it's views. I find that still matters a lot to companies. The one thing I would say about results is, don't try to fool anybody. Too many content people just don't accept the fact that it's very hard to prove return on investment. And that's a critical thing. I get it. It's very important. But there's a lot of phony ROI metrics out there, and particularly in marketing. And of course, the journalist in me is being skeptical about this. But you can't really prove that because you had a webinar and somebody came and then they read other stories, that's why a partner got a $10 million deal. I asked them and they go, no, that had nothing to do with it. Sometimes it has something to do with it. You just have to have the faith that if you're promoting the brand and showing how smart you are, that there is a value to it. And I will add that the price of doing content is minuscule compared to many marketing projects. And so it's not a high risk proposition. I'm just budget wise, the company is very generous to me, but it's not enormous. It's not into the millions and millions of dollars. But that goes a long way, I think, toward running a commercial that has a value but is extremely expensive. So go with the metrics that you have and believe in them, and don't try to sell somebody on something else. They're just too smart. They're going to see right through it.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably have a whole separate hour-long conversation around marketing measurement and whatnot. We actually an interesting conversation I had was with Mark Stoos, he's the CEO of a media mix modeling firm out here in Scottsdale area called Proof Analytics, and talked to him about that. I think he was I'm trying to remember, the CMO at one of the Honeywell divisions back in the day, etc. So that's an interesting one for anybody who wants to dive more into the measurement discussion.
Well, I often make the analogy to the newspaper field when I talk to I'm in marketing, my marketing colleagues. The Wall Street Journal could never prove why its ad was worth $150,000, a one-page ad. And lo and behold, the internet came and kind of showed it wasn't worth it. And it went down and down and down. And, I fear that marketing is going to face that there'll be CFOs who always have their teeth in what marketing is spending, will look deeper and deeper into that. So I very much kind of encourage my marketing colleagues to look for less expensive ways to sell your product. It's very valuable what you're doing, but it's hard to prove the value over time.
Yeah. I'm curious in terms of, how does that conversation go for you internally? I mean, I'm assuming someone's asking you, hey, what have you done for me lately, kind of thing. How does that conversation go for you?
Well, again, I rely on the numbers that I have. I've had 7 years. Every year has gone up. I keep creating new platforms. When I came to the company, there was just the magazine. There was no website. And now I have 6 different platforms. So when they ask me what I did lately, I say, well, you now have a podcast. We even just started an internal podcast. Instead of putting out an internal newsletter, we created a 5-minute podcast. It's called Korn Ferry Catch Up. and as a new way. So it is a dance. You got to keep reinventing yourself and reinventing how you tell a story. And it's precisely because, as opposed to the person who's actually landing the deal, who I have enormous respect for, it is really selling it directly. I've got to reinvent myself to remotely keep up with what they're doing.
So, one last kind of call it tactical question for you. I mean, you mentioned your budget's not huge, but comparison to the types of clients we usually work with, more mid-market boutique type firms, it's much bigger, right? So, what would your recommendation be to those folks who are, again, whether that's the CEO or a CMO or a CRO, whatever, that's in a say like $50 to $100 million firm, and they're trying to spin up an initiative like this. They're trying to improve their thought leadership.
It's really don't assume it's what I find in talking to CEOs from that size firms is they just go, this is just too expensive for me to do. It actually isn't. When I started, it was just me and another person. And because Korn Ferry is big, or of course we can get bigger and bigger, but there are ways of doing it if you have the right team without like blowing enormous sums of money on it, and shy away from people that are telling you they need $30,000 per episode per podcast when you can, with the help of artificial intelligence, you can do it for a fraction of that. So it's, you start small and you'll see results, I think. One thing I'd say is I don't think there's a company in the world that can't use what we're kind of doing in content. I used to go to hedge funds and say, what are you doing? You're sending out a letter once a quarter and telling me how you're spending my money. It's like, I want to know. I don't want to just look at the Wall Street Journal. I want to see news events and see what you have to say about it. And if you're like a retailer, it's like the head of Target. He's Brian Cornell, who I interviewed years ago. He's doing fascinating things, or was, on the design of the products they were putting out. Had a whole design team. But if you go to their website, when you went to it then, it would just have the shirts up. You could buy it. It didn't keep you there. And I think that there's really not a product in the world that doesn't have a story behind it. There's not a service in the world that doesn't have a story, and that they're not being told. And that if you tell people, they'll be engaged. And to me, if they're engaged, they're much more likely to buy that product.
That's a very good point, because there's a reason why how I built this podcast is so popular still, right? People are interested in and care about these stories, whether it's because they buy that product themselves or they're just curious. But either way, that's
I noticed in your own
that's a very good point.
You and your wife are just intellectually curious, and that drives it and keeps you watching it for the 40 minutes. And it's also divided in sections, so you have some idea of what's coming. But the point is, it's like you're keeping people engaged, and hopefully that's helping sell your product. And, I don't know what your cost is to produce it, but
our cost is very. I agree with you. Look, we use an outsourced team. We use, Riverside is what, $20 a month. Like, we're not spending a lot of money on production. Now, obviously, again, if you have to outsource everything, it's going to cost you more than that, and you can have better camera equipment than we currently use. For example, you can have a set versus just my, office with the reflection of my window or whatnot. But do you have to? No, not in this setting, I don't think. So I completely agree with you. There are very cost-effective ways to start. And I think that probably the most important thing is really going back to something you said very early on, is really understanding your audience. That's probably the key.
Well, and the key thing is there's very little competition. There just isn't much content out there that's trying to be timely. It's not just trying to give eye stock art. It's trying to do podcasts that have just a little morsel of differences to it. And none of those steps, they're still great pictures in iStock. It's just going to take you another 30 minutes to dig through all of them and to put in the keywords to find that. But that's not like millions and millions of dollar investment.
I mean, these days, all you need is a $20 ChatGPT subscription and get whatever you want out of Dolly.
Yeah.
Or Midjourney, whatever.
Yeah, they're just a lot more tools that way.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, you mentioned 40 minutes. We're coming up on 50 here, so this has been great. One other section left on our side, which is the lightning round. If you're ready for it,
I'm ready.
All right. Well, I think I know your answer already, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. What's the main KPI you use to evaluate marketing success?
It's page views. It's views. It's the metrics of how many watched you. It's open rates. With our newsstand, it's what's been sold on the newsstand. But it's fairly basic numbers. And as I say, you're not going to get anywhere probably reaching something else, although some people feel they have a magic formula, and maybe they do.
So you've put out, I think you mentioned 6 different properties. What's something new you're looking forward to testing out this over the next 12 months? I don't know, is there something new coming out?
The magazine digitally, we're trying to be much more interactive and take it to a whole nother level so that it's a lot more fun. We use this platform, Seros, which is very good. We want to, either using Seros or some other product, we want to be much more engaging, to have voices, other material thrown in so that it's far more enjoyable to read. It's hard to do that. Kind of doubles the work, but I'm looking forward to that if I get the budget for it.
What is a quote unquote best practice that in your field that you wish would go by the wayside?
Well, it's in my field. It's not so much me, but that's the review process. I think that most firms have this review process, and obviously there's some legal, if you're working for Fidelity or whatever, there may be legal ramifications of what you can say, but pretty much teach the editors what those are and have them do the review process. And then when you hear if you've done something wrong or hasn't gone well over, just understand that you can fix it. But I would limit the review process. Not eliminate it, but limit it.
Yep. I completely agree with you on that one. Nothing worse than dealing with, say, their podcast or something like that for like a med device company. Done a few of those.
Yeah.
That is brutal.
That's the hardest.
What is your?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
That's the hardest jump to make. I mean, half of your people watching this will go, "I'll never hire Jonathan Dahl." It's very difficult. There's a lot of egos involved in that. All I can do is be authentic and say what I think works. But I don't see it done in a lot of places. Even though I think if they looked at what we did, they'd say, "Wow, that's really great stuff." But it's difficult. It's a difficult journey to get to.
For sure. What is your least favorite business word or phrase?
Thank you for sharing that.
First time someone said that, but I like that.
I get that in emails. I get that when I'm trying to have a heart to heart with someone, and it's kind of like I get it, and it's polite, and I use it myself all the time. But the truth is, it doesn't feel authentic. They're not happy you shared it. You're just annoying them, and you're asking for money and you're asking for promotion. Thank you for sharing that. Well, you're not really happy that they're doing that.
Right.
Be authentic in your conversation. Although that's another phrase I'd like to get rid of. Be authentic. I mean, just tell me the truth.
Yeah, it's interesting how a lot of these words they were good in the beginning, but they just end up losing their meaning over time as people use them more and more, and the definition just gets completely bastardized. What is your favorite business or marketing book?
It's not a business book. It's called The Power Broker by Robert Caro, and um, I go back and read it all the time because it reminds me of the depth of research that people need. It's a book about Robert Moses, who designed, it was only the park commissioner of New York, but he's responsible for all the highways and everything there. But the depth of the reporting is something that I just have enormous amount of admiration for. And obviously, I don't expect that in a 500-word story, but that principle of questioning and looking hasn't changed at all.
All right, one last fun one. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Patience. I wish I was more patient.
You seem like a very patient man.
Well, I'm on a podcast and I'm not under deadline, and I'm not, I'm blessed with a team that understands me and works with me. But it takes, I watch other people in the corporate world. I never saw it in the journalism world at the Wall Street Journal. Try working for Rupert Murdoch, and you'll understand that patience was not his main word. But I admire it. I admire the ability to pause before you think, before you say something. I admire the ability to have it, not come across too charged in how you phrase things. And it's something I wish I was better at.
Yeah, I still have a fairly young child. She's 8, and I look at other parents, and that I definitely appreciate the patient ones, because that I am not one of those.
Yeah. And I just think it's a skill set that is critical. That's an example of what a journalist doesn't have, and many people in the corporate world do have. And it's a very hard skill set to learn. But I'm working
That
on it.
is that's probably as perfect of a place to end as I
Sure.
could purposefully come up with. So, Jonathan, this has been amazing. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge. I'm assuming if
Yeah,
people want
thank
to
you.
connect with you on LinkedIn or anything, they can do that and ask questions.
Yes, LinkedIn, or it's Jonathan.Dahl at kornferry.com. Uh, I'm always welcome to hear things and ideas. But this is a great podcast. You should be very proud of what you put out. It's not easy to do. Now that I got involved in podcasts, I really understand that. But it's very thoughtful what you ask and what you do, and I think that really is smart and helpful.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Jonathan, thank you very much. And everybody else,
Thank
we'll
you.
see you all next week.
Yep.